back again. Sit down. To study, to rest, or to take a hard look at the Cold War. Get ready as we go back to May of 1960. This is all fictional history. It involves turning historical figures into animals, to reveal the primitive instincts that really underlie these incidents. The U-2 crises and the Gladio operation are real. The animals are entirely made up, but their world. This exists. These are the forms that power takes. When it thinks it won't be observed, I hope Ipu enjoys.
Introduction: The World Before the Fall. April 30, 1960, the eve. The sky above Peshawar had not yet decided what color it wanted to be. It hung there, vast and indeterminate, somewhere between the bruised violet of departing night and the pale gold that preceded the Pakistani dawn, a sky that could not make up its mind, which was in some sense appropriate. April 30th, 1960 was a day of unmade decisions, a day of held breath, a day that existed, historically speaking, on the knife edge between what had been and what was about to be shattered beyond repair. In a hangar on the outskirts of the city, beneath the humming fluorescent lights that gave everything the color of old bone, an eagle was performing his pre-flight checks. His name was Edgar Vance, though in the operational logs he was listed only as Overflight Alpha. He was 41 years old in human reckoning, lean, precise, with a wingspan that, when extended to its full measure, cast a shadow like a small aircraft itself. His feathers were the deep brown of old mahogany polished to a high shine, except across his chest and the crown of his head, where they faded to white. The white of Arctic glaciers, of state documents, of the pure theoretical innocence that his government liked to project to the world, while men like Edgar did the work that innocence could not survive. He had been a pilot before he was a spy. He had been a dreamer before he was a pilot. He had been a young eagle in Tennessee, watching the commercial airliner's knife through the clouds above Lookout Mountain and feeling something tighten in his chest that he had no name for then, a hunger so precise it felt almost like grief. He had learned eventually that the name for it was vocation, a calling. The sense that the sky did not merely exist above you, but was, in some fundamental sense, yours, that it had always been waiting, with the patience of geological time, for you specifically to come and claim it. The CIA had recruited him in 1957, through a series of conversations so oblique that he had not realized what was happening until he was already 3 meetings deep, and had signed documents he would spend the rest of his life pretending did not exist. They had told him about the program with the calm, matter-of-fact professionalism that he would come to understand was the intelligence community's version of intimacy, the U-2, a reconnaissance aircraft. A machine designed to fly so high that the curvature of the Earth became visible, that the sky above turned from blue to the absolute black of space, that the pilot sat in a pressure suit that made him look like something between an astronaut and a deep-sea diver, breathing 100% oxygen for an hour before takeoff to purge the nitrogen from his bloodstream, because at 70,000 feet, nitrogen would kill you from the inside. They had told him the aircraft was essentially invulnerable to Soviet interception. They had told him that if anything went wrong, he would have certain options available to him. They had implied, without ever quite saying it, that certain options was a kind of shorthand, and that the shorthand meant one specific thing. Edgar had nodded because that was what you did. You nodded and you signed and you flew, and you told yourself that the work you were doing, photographing Soviet missile installations from altitudes that no human eye and no radar system could reliably reach, was the kind of work that kept the world from ending, that the photographs you brought back were the difference between deterrence and catastrophe, that the eye in the sky was the only honest witness in a world where everyone lied. He believed this. He had to. It was the only way the whole arrangement made sense. Now he checked the pressurization seals on his suit, one gloved talon moving with practiced precision across each fastening, each valve, each seam. The ground crew, a mongoose named Hicks, who spoke exclusively in military abbreviations, and a nervous young ferret from the technical division, whose name Edgar had never properly learned, moved around the aircraft with the careful reverence of priests preparing a sacrament. The aircraft itself was extraordinary. The Lockheed U-2, designated Article 360 in the program logs, was a thing of almost offensive elegance. Its body narrow as a needlepoint, its wings absurdly long and drooping, designed to become rigid and aerodynamically perfect only at altitude, when the thin air pressed against them with a pressure so precise it was almost philosophical. It was painted black. It looked, in the dimness of the hangar, like a letter written in a language that nobody had yet invented the alphabet to read. "Weather is nominal," said Hicks, consulting his clipboard. "Winds at altitude within parameters. Visibility over the route." He paused, looked at Edgar with the flat, professional affect that was the mongoose equivalent of concern. "Visibility over the route is assessed as excellent." "Excellent," Edgar repeated. "That is the assessment, sir." Edgar looked at the aircraft. He had flown this route, or routes very like it, 11 times. Each time he had crossed over the Soviet Union at altitude, over Sverdlovsk, over the Ural Mountains, over the vast tundra that stretched east toward whatever the Russians kept east of the Urals and were very careful not to let anyone see. He had felt the same thing. A sensation that was not quite fear and not quite exhilaration, but occupied the space between them with the comfortable permanence of a tenant who has signed a very long lease. He thought about what his handler, an older eagle named Colonel Richard Bassett, who was, despite his name, very much an eagle, a great bald specimen of the Haliaetus persuasion, whose generation had flown in the Pacific and never quite come back from it in any psychological sense, had said to him 2 days ago during the final briefing. "You understand the timing," Bassett had said. It was not a question. "The Paris summit," Edgar had said, May 16th. Eisenhower and Khrushchev, 16 days from now, the most significant diplomatic meeting since Potsdam. Bassett had folded his wings and looked at Edgar with eyes that were the color of old amber. "This mission has been authorized at the highest level. The intelligence gathered will inform our negotiating position. Every photograph you bring back is a playing card. And if we are caught?" The silence that followed that question had been, in retrospect, its own kind of answer. Far to the north and the west, in a city that was then the second largest city in the Soviet Empire and the capital of a particular kind of bureaucratic darkness, another animal was also preparing. Moscow at midnight was a different kind of sky entirely. The wolf's name was Grigory Volkov, which meant of wolves in Russian, which was the kind of nominative determinism that the KGB occasionally indulged in, not out of any mystical belief, but because sometimes the records were easier to keep when the name announced itself. He was not an old wolf, 43, which in wolf terms was the age at which the grey of the muzzle began to be undeniable, and the eyes settled into a steadiness that the young mistook for serenity and the experienced recognized as something else entirely, the steadiness of a predator who has learned to wait. He sat at his desk in the first Chief Directorate building, which was located at that time in the old district near the Lubyanka, a building so notorious that Muscovites had developed the habit of not looking at it directly, the way you might avoid looking at the sun. The desk was clean. Grigory kept his desk clean in the way that certain men keep themselves clean, not from squeamishness, but from discipline. Clutter was a form of dishonesty. It suggested that one had more in progress than one could control. He had 3 items on his desk tonight. The first was a cable from his station chief in Vienna, which he had now read 7 times and was still not entirely satisfied with. The cable described a meeting between a Swiss banker named Herr Steinbach, who was in the KGB's files, listed under the operational code Mole 3, which was a designation that made Grigory wince slightly because moles were, in his view, an insult to the sophistication of the network they represented, and a Belgian industrialist whose connection to certain NATO logistics networks had been of interest for 18 months. The meeting had lasted 3 hours. Herr Steinbach had taken no notes. He took no notes, Grigory had said to his deputy, a young fox named Anatoly, whose quick intelligence Grigory valued without quite trusting, because he was memorizing everything. The absence of notes is the presence of professionalism. Anatoly had nodded in the eager way of the young, and Grigory had gone back to reading the cable a 4th time, because the 4th reading always found something the 3rd reading missed. The second item was a surveillance photograph, grainy and slightly overexposed in the way of photographs taken from distance under surveillance conditions. It showed a man, a badger, in the animal taxonomy of this world, leaving the British Embassy in Bern at 11:47 on the evening of April 18th. The badger was wearing a coat that was too light for the weather, which suggested haste or carelessness or both. His name was not listed on the photograph. In Grigory's file, he was known as Subject Breyer. The third item was a single sheet of paper, double-spaced, in the careful typography of official correspondence. It was a preliminary assessment from the Technical Directorate. It described the performance envelope of a high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft of American manufacture. It described what altitude that aircraft could reach. It described, with the measured optimism of engineers who have been told what the leadership wants to hear, whether the new SA-2 Divina surface-to-air missile system could reach that altitude. The assessment concluded with the kind of qualified certainty that was the intelligence community's version of a prayer, that under optimal conditions, the system could. Grigory had read this document, and then he had looked out the window at the Moscow sky, which was the color of iron at this hour, cold iron without luster, and he had thought about what it meant for a predator to know that his territory had been violated, what it did to the animal to know that something had been passing overhead all this time, what it required in response. He was not a cruel wolf. This is important to establish because the temptation with intelligence officers, particularly those of the Soviet variety, in the Western imagination of that era, was to assume cruelty, a kind of ideological viciousness. Grigory had seen that in his colleagues in the Stalinist generation that preceded him, in the apparatus that had consumed so many of his country's best minds and produced only silence and fear. He had survived that era through a combination of luck, usefulness, and a talent for making himself indispensable to whoever was currently in favor without making himself threatening to whoever was currently in power. But he was not cruel. He was more precisely convinced. He believed genuinely in the way that certain people believe in gravity or mathematics that his country was surrounded, that the forces aligned against the Soviet experiment were not merely political opponents but existential threats, that the work he did, the long watching and waiting and cultivating and turning, was not a matter of ideology in any abstract sense, but of survival in the most concrete one. He believed that the sky above his country was being violated. And he had the technical assessment that suggested he might, for the first time, be able to do something about it. He picked up the telephone. Between Washington and Moscow, the Atlantic Ocean performed its usual indifference. It had been doing this for a long time, sitting there, vast and unimpressed, while the creatures on its edges convinced themselves that the next 10 years would be decisive. The ocean had watched empires rise and recede. It understood that decisive was a word that organisms used when they were frightened, and that what they usually meant by it was, this time we hope to finally be safe. The ocean, which had observed the general pattern of organisms and their hopes, was not optimistic on this point. But the ocean's perspective, while useful, is not the story. The story is smaller than the ocean and larger than any single animal in it. The story is a week. 7 days in May 1960, when the world was divided absolutely, East and West, communism and capitalism, the Red Star and the White Star, and two animals, one on each side, moved through their opposite halves of the same broken world, carrying between them in their separate ways the weight of what was about to happen. The eagle had his flight plan. The wolf had his cable and his photographs and his technical assessment. The summit was 16 days away. The sky was not yet light. Chapter 1, Day 1, Monday, May 1 ST 1960. It's May Day. May Day, International Workers' Day. The day the Soviet Union paraded its military hardware through Red Square with the meticulous choreography of a nation demonstrating, to itself as much as anyone, that it was not afraid. Edgar Vance was already above 60,000 feet when the parade began. He had taken off at 6:20 in the morning, Peshawar time, in the early light of a Central Asian dawn that was the color of hammered bronze. The pre-flight procedures had consumed the previous hour with a rigorous, meditative thoroughness. The breathing of pure oxygen to purge the nitrogen, the suiting up in the pressurized ensemble that turned him from an eagle into something approaching an astronaut, the final systems check conducted in the peculiar quiet that existed between the last human conversation and the moment of flight. Hicks had shaken his hand, not metaphorically. The mongoose had extended his small, dry hand and Edgar had taken it, because certain formalities only exist at the margins of extreme risk, and they matter precisely because of that. The takeoff had been unremarkable. This was, in its way, the deepest strangeness of the U-2 program, that the most dangerous thing a pilot could do in 1960, overfly the Soviet Union in a surveillance aircraft, began with an unremarkable takeoff, a routine ascent, an ordinary departure from an ordinary morning. The drama was all deferred. It collected itself in the upper atmosphere and waited. At 70,000 feet, the sky above Edgar was black. Not the black of night, with its familiar texture of stars and seasonal familiarity, but the absolute black of space. The black that existed before the concept of color was invented, the black of the universe before the first star lit. He was at the interface between atmosphere and vacuum, in the place where the air became so thin that it was technically still air by certain definitions and not air by others. The U-2 slid through this ambiguity with its usual self-possession, the long wings barely flexed by the atmosphere that supported them, the engine running with the clean efficiency of a machine operating precisely within its design parameters. Below him, the Soviet Union. He could see it. That was the thing that never stopped being astonishing, the thing he could never quite communicate to anyone who had not sat in this seat and looked down through this canopy at this angle. He could see it. Not in the way you see a country from a commercial airliner, the patchwork quilt of farmland and road, the clustered suburbs, the glittering indication of a city, but in the way you see the earth when you are far enough away to understand that it is a whole thing, a unity. He could see the curvature of the horizon. He could see in the haze to the northwest what might have been the beginning of the Ural mountain range, and beyond it, the suggestion of the vast Siberian plain. He had a camera in the belly of the aircraft that was longer than most automobiles and could resolve objects on the ground to an accuracy of 2.5 feet from this altitude. He was functionally a god of seeing, an eye in the sky that saw everything and was itself unseen. This was the arrangement he had made with the universe. He checked his instruments. Altitude 70,500 feet, speed Mach 0.7, fuel within normal parameters. He consulted the navigation equipment, a system of astral sightings and dead reckoning that was, by the standards of the era, extraordinarily sophisticated, and confirmed his position over Soviet territory. Below him, near the city of Sverdlovsk, which would eventually, in another 30 years, become Yekaterinburg again, the city where the last Tsar was shot. Because Russia has a long memory for where things end, the camera was running. Photographs, hundreds of them. The black film unspooling in the belly of the aircraft, capturing the landscape below with an impartiality that almost felt like justice. Military installations, railway junctions, the geometric signatures of missile sites, the distinctive star-shaped excavation patterns that analysts back at Langley had learned to identify the way ornithologists learn to identify birds from the shape of their silhouettes. Everything that could be seen was being recorded. Edgar felt, as he always did at this point in a mission, the strange double consciousness of the aerial observer, the detachment that altitude enforced, and beneath it, pressing upward, the knowledge that below those abstractly beautiful patterns of roads and rivers and industrial infrastructure were animals, millions of them, who did not know he was there. He thought about this, not for the first time. The privacy of the people below him, their absolute ignorance of his presence, the way their lives continued in their Soviet dailiness, the May Day parade, the factory shifts, the queues for bread and the queues for theatre tickets, and the queues for the simple satisfaction of having queued for something, while 60 miles above them, a machine with wings and a camera passed silently through the frontier of space. What did it mean, that he could see them but they could not see him? He did not reach a conclusion. He rarely did on these questions. The intelligence community had a saying, analysis is for Langley, the pilot's job is to get the pictures home. He adjusted his heading by 3 degrees and focused on his instruments. In Sverdlovsk at that moment, Grigory Volkov was not at his desk. He was, in fact, several thousand kilometers from his Moscow desk, which was itself unusual. Grigory was not a man who enjoyed field positions, preferring the precise world of documents and cables and the cultivation of assets from the careful distance of the coordinator. But the technical assessment had been upgraded. The technical assessment had become an operational order. And operational orders, when they came from the level they had come from, required a senior officer to be present. He stood in a concrete room that smelled of electrical equipment and nervous men, watching the radar screens with the concentrated attention of a wolf at a burrow. The radar equipment was Soviet-built, which meant it was, in its large components, reliable, and in its smaller components, a source of continuous anxiety. The men operating it, young wolves and bears and the occasional grim-faced lynx, moved with the careful precision of people who understood that the man standing behind them was not the kind of man you wanted to disappoint. "Contact?" Grigory asked. His voice was quiet. It was always quiet. Grigory had learned decades ago that a quiet voice required the room to fall still to hear it, and a still room was an attentive room. "At the edge of detection range, Comrade General," said the lead operator, a young wolf barely into his 20s, with the tense posture of someone who has been awake for 16 hours and is aware that this is not the time to show it. Altitude assessment puts it at a pause, a consultation of instruments, above 70,000 meters. Above 70,000 meters, above the ceiling of every previous interception attempt, above the SA-2's theoretical maximum. "The previous assessments," Grigory said, "indicated optimal conditions." "Yes, Comrade General." "Are these optimal conditions?" The young wolf looked at his instruments, then at Grigory, then at his instruments again, performing the calculation between accuracy and self-preservation with the speed that survival situations require. "The atmospheric conditions are within the envelope described in the technical assessment," he said carefully. "The contact is at the edge of the engagement zone." "Then engage." The word fell into the room like a stone into still water. What happened next would later be reconstructed in congressional hearings and Kremlin post-mortems, and declassified documents and academic papers, and one particularly good novel that got the geography slightly wrong but the psychology exactly right. What happened was this. At 8:53 in the morning Sverdlovsk time, a Soviet SA-2 Dvina surface-to-air missile battery fired upon the target. Not one missile, several. The first missile passed behind the aircraft. The second was close enough. Edgar felt it before he understood it. A pressure that was wrong, a vibration that had no counterpart in any pre-flight briefing or training exercise. And then this came later, in the testimony and in the nightmares, a tremendous orange flash to his left, and the aircraft rolling, and the controls not responding, and the nose pitching down with a purposefulness that no malfunction should have possessed. His training kicked in with the cold automaticity of a mechanism too well designed to require thinking. His hand went to the destruct switches, the switches that would destroy the camera equipment, the film, the intelligence, the evidence of what he had been doing above the Soviet Union. He reached for the eject handle. The sequence of events in the next 90 seconds would be argued about for decades. The aircraft was going down. The camera was not destroyed, the destruct mechanism failed, or he could not reach it in the physical chaos of the failing aircraft, or the sequence was interrupted. The film existed. He ejected. At 30,000 feet beneath him, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was waiting. The parachute opened. Edgar Vance, pilot, Eagle, agent of the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States of America, drifted down through the May morning sky toward the Soviet Earth. He was, for the first time in his professional career, entirely without a plan. In Moscow, at Red Square, the parade continued. The missiles rolled through, the intercontinental ballistic kind, the world-ending kind, the kind that Nikita Khrushchev, from his reviewing stand, watched with the satisfaction of a man who has mortgaged everything he owns to build a fence and is pleased to see that the fence looks impressive from the road. The crowd cheered with the specific timbre of a crowd that has been told to cheer and has decided after the first few minutes that it actually means it. Khrushchev, a badger in the taxonomy of this world, squat and stubborn and possessed of a temper that was like a very small volcano, usually dormant, frequently rumbling, occasionally capable of leveling a significant diplomatic landscape, stood watching his missiles with the expression of a man who knows something. He did know something. His intelligence service had just told him what it was. But he did not yet know everything. He knew the aircraft had been brought down. He did not yet know that the pilot had survived. He did not know about the film. He was conducting in his mind the kind of preliminary calculation that distinguished the intelligence-literate statesman from his counterpart. What does Washington know? What does Washington think I know? What do I know that Washington thinks I don't know? This was the recursive algebra of the Cold War. It had no solution. It had only iterations. He watched his missiles roll past and said nothing. In the crowd below, 1,000 animals cheered, and the spring sun shone on everything equally, as it always does. Grigory was on a secure telephone to Moscow within the hour. "The aircraft is confirmed down," he said, in the clipped, economical language of the KGB professional. "The pilot," he paused. The pause was deliberate. It carried information. "The pilot is in custody." The voice on the other end of the line was the deputy director's, a polar bear named Serov, who communicated primarily in silences interrupted by the occasional devastating monosyllable. There was a silence now. "Intact," Serov said eventually. "Intact." Another silence. In the grammar of KGB communication, this silence meant, "This changes things." "The General Secretary will need to be briefed." "I understand." "The briefing," Serov said, "will require careful consideration of the timing." Grigory understood this too. The timing was everything. The United States would, within hours, begin explaining the disappearance of their aircraft. They would construct a cover story, weather aircraft, navigation malfunction, and they would deliver it with the smooth confidence of a government that was certain its aircraft could not be shot down and its pilots could not survive. The cover story would be a lie. But it would be a lie that, if Khrushchev chose to accept it, could be used as a kind of diplomatic currency. We know you are lying, you know we know, and in this shared knowledge, we can, perhaps, continue to do business. Or the cover story could be exposed, the pilot could be presented, the wreckage could be displayed. The film, if the film had survived, and Grigori's people were already on their way to the crash site to determine this, could be developed. And then the summit would become something else entirely. Grigori said, "I will prepare both briefing scenarios." Serov said, "Yes." Grigori hung up the telephone and looked out the window of the concrete room at the Sverdlovsk sky, which was blue and enormous and entirely indifferent to the calculations occurring in the rooms beneath it. He thought about the eagle, where he was now, whether he was frightened. He thought, if I were the eagle, I would be frightened. He thought, but the eagle is an animal that spends its life above other animals, looking down. It is not accustomed to being on the ground. Being on the ground and being looked at, that is what it cannot prepare for. He picked up his pen and began to write the two briefing scenarios, which were in some sense the two possible futures of the next 2 weeks, and which he was already, at some level below conscious deliberation, choosing between. Edgar Vance, at that moment, was sitting in a Soviet detention facility in Sverdlovsk, still wearing the fragments of his precious suit, looking at his hands. His hands were fine. He had landed harder than he would have liked, in a field that was not expecting him, and there had been a confused and deeply strange encounter with a group of Soviet farmers, goats and a mule, elderly and unsurprised in the way that Russian farmers tended to be, as though the arrival of an American pilot from the sky was merely the latest in a long series of things that the 20th century had brought unexpectedly into their field, before the KGB officers arrived in their black car. The KGB officers had been professional. This surprised him, and he examined his surprise and understood from it that he had expected brutality and received instead a kind of bureaucratic correctness that was, in its own way, more frightening. Professionalism meant they knew what they were doing. Brutality would have been a variable. They had taken his suit. They had given him a plain grey garment that felt like stay tissue everything everywhere. They had offered him tea, which he had accepted because refusing seemed both foolish and ungracious in a way that might have consequences. He sat with his tea. He thought about Colonel Bassett and the silence that had followed his question about what would happen if. He thought about the technical options he had been provided, the options that were a kind of shorthand that he had understood to mean one specific thing, and he thought about the fact that he had not used them. He was not sure, even now, whether this was courage or cowardice, or simply the inability of a living animal to quite believe, in the final moment, that this is actually happening to me, that this is actually the situation in which I find myself, that the training and the preparation and the protocol have all arrived at this point, and this point is a grey garment and a cup of Soviet tea. He did not know yet what the wolf knew. He did not know about the film. He did not know that the world was about to discover, over the course of the next 16 days, whether it was capable of the kind of honesty that might prevent an apocalypse. He drank his tea. Outside the window of the detention facility, the Sverdlovsk sky was the same enormous blue it had been all morning. Chapter 2, Day 2, Tuesday, May 2 ND 1960. The shape of silence. The first rule of intelligence work, the rule that every training manual listed first, and every experienced operative eventually understood to be the only rule that mattered, was this: the time between event and knowledge is where the danger lives. Washington did not know. Not yet, not in any official, actionable sense. The U-2 program was so compartmentalized that the knowledge of its existence existed in fewer than 200 people in the entire United States government, and the news of the aircraft's disappearance had not yet climbed the narrow, steep stairs of classification to reach the desk of President Eisenhower, who was a horse, a gray horse, which was appropriate. Gray was the color of his presidency, gray in the sense of nuanced and careful, and possessed of a kind of earned wisdom that was the gift of age and the frustration of journalists, who found that wisdom in powerful men made for unsatisfying copy. He had been a general. He had led the largest amphibious operation in military history. He understood, better than most animals in positions of authority, that the gap between what has happened and what we know has happened was not an administrative inconvenience, but a strategic resource. But that gap was closing. In the CIA's offices on the reflecting pool in Washington, a building that was itself a kind of architectural cover story, designed to look like something else, which was fitting, a different eagle named Colonel Richard Bassett was also sitting with a telephone, and the news coming through the telephone was the news that every controller dreads. "No contact since scheduled check-in," said the voice from Peshawar. "Aircraft not returned, pilot not accounted for." Bassett put down the telephone and sat for a moment with the stillness that distinguished the truly dangerous from the merely powerful. He was an older eagle, 62, with the white head of his species now showing the yellowish tint of age, the eyes still brilliant and precise, the wings carrying the slight asymmetry of an old injury, a reminder of the Pacific that he had stopped noticing. He thought about Edgar. He thought about the mission. He thought about what he had told Edgar about the aircraft being essentially invulnerable. He picked up the telephone again and asked to be connected to the deputy director. The cover story that was subsequently constructed, that the aircraft was a weather research plane operated by NASA, that it had experienced an oxygen failure over Turkey and the pilot had reported difficulties, and then there had been no further contact, was put together in approximately 6 hours. It had the clean, plausible surface of a well-made lie. It addressed all the obvious questions. It had the right documentation, because the U-2 program had prepared for this possibility with the thoroughness of people who deeply did not want it to happen. The cover story assumed one thing, that the aircraft was destroyed, and that if the pilot had survived, he had used the mechanism that was the shorthand that could not be spoken aloud. The cover story did not allow for the possibility that the pilot was alive and the film was intact. In Vienna, a badger was nervous. His name in the KGB files that Grigory had been reading 2 nights ago was Subject Breyer. His name in the British intelligence files was Contact 7. His own name, the one his mother had given him, and that he answered to in the ordinary transactions of a life that had become anything but ordinary, was Heinrich Maus, which was not a badger name but a mouse name, which was the kind of nominative contradiction that happened when your parents were German and optimistic, and the universe had a dry sense of humor. Heinrich Maus was a financial consultant. He had an office in Vienna's first district, 2 blocks from the opera, where the kind of money that moved between governments and corporations and the grey categories that existed between them came to be washed, folded, and returned to circulation in a form that preserved its function while obscuring its origin. He had been doing this for 11 years. He had been doing it for the last 4 years on behalf of a network that he understood only in fragments. He knew his section, his specific role, his contacts to the left and right, because the network was designed to be known only in fragments. That was the point. The network, though he did not know it by this name, was called Operation Gladio. Operation Gladio was a NATO secret that was more secret than most NATO secrets, which were themselves significantly more secret than the kinds of things that appeared in newspapers and the kinds of things that were discussed at diplomatic dinners, and even the kinds of things that were said in the most restricted intelligence briefings. Gladio was the network of stay-behind agents that NATO, meaning the CIA and its allied services, had established throughout Western Europe in the years following World War II. The theory was straightforward. If the Soviet Union invaded Western Europe and overran it, which in the early 1950s, with the Red Army's numerical superiority, was not an unreasonable strategic anxiety, there needed to be something already in place. Assets, networks. People who knew the territory, who had local roots, who could operate behind enemy lines that were their own streets and their own cities. The Italian name for this network, Gladio, the short sword of the Roman legionary, the weapon carried on the right side, the secondary weapon, had been chosen with a certain flourish that was characteristic of the Italian intelligence tradition. Other countries had their own versions, their own names, their own slightly different architectures. But the network was pan-European, coordinated through a committee that met in Brussels and reported to a command structure that connected to Langley through channels that would have made most legislators who sat on oversight committees reach for their blood pressure medication. Heinrich Maus knew about a fraction of this. He knew that he received payments from a Swiss foundation that he understood to be NATO adjacent. He knew that he occasionally provided financial consulting services to clients he did not meet in person, whose identities were encoded in account numbers, and whose requirements he transmitted through a system that combined the ordinariness of a business telephone with the extraordinary complexity of a prearranged cipher. He knew that this consulting had, at certain points in the past 11 years, involved movements of money that were not, in the strictest technical sense, entirely consistent with Austrian banking regulations. He knew that if the wrong people ever looked carefully enough, there would be questions. The nervousness that afflicted him this Tuesday morning was a professional nervousness, the kind that is not acute but chronic, a low-grade awareness that the life he was living had too many seams, that the two halves of his existence, legitimate consultant, Gladio financial node, were separated by walls that felt, on certain mornings, slightly thinner than they had been the week before. He was meeting today with a Belgian industrialist named Hendrik van Dale. Van Dale was a rhinoceros, which was not unusual for Belgian industrialists of his generation, and which manifested in his case as a kind of lumbering financial certainty, a conviction that the sheer weight of his assets and connections would navigate most obstacles without requiring him to understand them. He had contracts with NATO logistics networks. He had contracts with companies that had contracts with defense ministries. He had a very fine house in Brussels and a somewhat finer house in the Swiss mountains and an extremely fine wine cellar wherever he happened to be. He also had, in the KGB's assessment of his situation, a vulnerability. This assessment was correct, but its specifics were known only to the wolf, who had spent the better part of 2 years cultivating the understanding of Van Dale's vulnerability with the patient, methodical thoroughness that distinguished the best intelligence work from the merely competent variety. Grigori was not in Vienna. He was back in Moscow now, at his desk, which was plain, with the 3 items replaced by different 3 items, a cable from Vienna, a preliminary forensic report from the U-2 crash site, and a schedule for the coming week that had been significantly revised overnight. The forensic report was excellent. The wreckage of the aircraft had been located and secured. The camera was intact. The film was recoverable. The pilot's equipment, including identification documents, personal items, and several items that were inconsistent with the cover story of a civilian weather researcher, was in hand. Grigori read the forensic report 3 times. Each reading added something. The first reading gave him the facts. The second gave him their implications. The third gave him, in the space between implication and conclusion, something that he had not expected, a kind of empathy. The personal items, a wedding ring, a photograph, a notebook with the sparse, functional notations of a professional who has learned to carry nothing that cannot be explained, constituted, when read carefully, a portrait. The portrait of an animal who had believed in what he was doing, who had thought, in the way that certain kinds of conviction allows, that the risk was worth the return. Grigori had believed in things too. He still did, which made him, among his peers, somewhat unusual. He set aside the forensic report and picked up the Vienna cable. The Vienna cable described the meeting between subject Breyer and contact DAEL, which was his designation in the KGB files, and assessed it as significant. Breyer had transmitted, through the careful, deniable mechanism of conversation, certain information about upcoming modifications to the Gladio network's financial architecture in the Southern European theatre. Italy specifically. The information was not by itself operational, but it confirmed the outline of the network's structure in ways that the KGB's Vienna station had been trying to confirm for 2 years. Grigori wrote 3 notes on the cable. The first concerned follow-up questions for the Vienna station. The second concerned the Italian theatre and the urgency of increasing surveillance there. The third was a single line, drawn from a consideration that had been occupying him since the previous night. The U2 incident and the Gladio exposure are not separate problems. They are potentially different facets of the same strategic opportunity. He underlined this. Then he put the cable in his drawer and looked at the schedule. The schedule showed the Paris summit in 16 days, in 14 days, in an eternity and an instant. He thought about what kind of wolf he wanted to be when he arrived in Paris. In his detention room in Sverdlovsk, Edgar was doing something that his training had not quite prepared him for. He was being patient. He had been questioned twice now, brief, preliminary sessions, conducted by officers who were clearly gathering information for a superior who had not yet appeared. The questions had been reasonable in their reasonableness. His name, his rank, though this was complicated, since he was technically a civilian contractor despite being a military pilot, which was one of the program's more creative legal constructions, his aircraft, his mission. He had provided his name. He had provided nothing else, which was the protocol, and he had stuck to the protocol with the rigidity of someone who understands that the protocol is the only thing between him and a series of choices that have no good options. The Soviet officers had been, so far, professionally persistent and personally neutral. They had offered him food, a bowl of something that was probably borscht, purple and substantial, and he had eaten it because refusing food was foolish and because it was actually quite good, which was a discovery that complicated his understanding of the enemy in a small but persistent way. He was an eagle in a room without sky. This was, he was discovering, its own form of torture. Not the crude variety, not the sort that leaves marks. The Soviet officers had been scrupulous about that. But the absence of altitude, the absence of the particular psychological state that altitude induced, the clearness, the overview, the sense of being above the complicated mess of terrestrial existence and therefore in some sense exempt from its conditions. He was not above anything. He was fully, completely, irreducibly in it. He thought about his wife, a gentle owl named Martha, who was in Virginia and did not know exactly what her husband did, which was how the program required it to be, and who would be, he calculated, receiving a visit from men in suits at some point in the next 24 to 48 hours, if she had not already, and who would be told, what? The cover story, the weather plane. He thought, she will know. She will know that the cover story is a cover story, because she has been married to me for 16 years and she is not foolish. He thought, and she will not be able to say so to anyone. He closed his eyes. He thought about the black sky at 70,000 feet, the curve of the earth, the absolute black that was not darkness but the absence of atmosphere, the universe's own color, before any star existed to argue for light. He had been in that sky. He was now in this room. Both were true. He was trying to hold both of them in his mind simultaneously, because he suspected that the ability to do so, to maintain the knowledge that the sky existed, even from the room that had no sky, was the kind of thing that would matter before this was over. Chapter 3, Day 3, Wednesday, May 40th, 1960. The geometry of lies. The cover story was running. NASA released its statement on May 3rd. A weather research aircraft had been on a high-altitude meteorological mission over Turkey. The pilot had reported an oxygen failure. The aircraft was missing. All appropriate search and rescue efforts were being conducted. The statement was released under the name of a NASA official, a pleasant, bureaucratically capable rabbit named Dr. Harrison Cole, who had been briefed on exactly what he needed to know and not one fact more, and it was received by the press with the mild skepticism that the press applied to all official statements, which was a skepticism of form rather than substance. The reporters filed their stories. The stories noted the disappearance. The stories accepted the explanation, because the explanation was plausible and because nobody had yet suggested an alternative. In Washington, the small circle of animals who knew the truth watched the cover story run with the concentrated anxiety of people who are watching a house fire and have been told that the fire department is on its way and that they should stand back and not panic, and above all not run toward the building and try to do anything themselves. Bassett in his office was not panicking. He was doing the thing that intelligence officers do instead of panicking, which was analysis. He was working through the possibilities with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understands that the range of bad outcomes is finite and that the worst thing you can do is fail to identify them all. Possibility 1, the aircraft was destroyed. The pilot used the mechanism that could not be named. There is nothing for the Soviets to display. The cover story holds. Possibility 2, the aircraft was destroyed. The pilot survived and was captured, but the film and equipment are destroyed. The cover story holds for a while, then the pilot's testimony creates complications. Possibility 3, the aircraft was partially intact. The film survived, the pilot survived. The cover story is a trap. He had ranked these in order of likelihood and in order of consequence, and the rankings did not align, which was the problem. The least likely possibility was the one with the worst consequences. This was, Bassett thought, the fundamental geometry of disaster. The things that are most carefully prepared against are therefore statistically unlikely. The things that are statistically unlikely are, when they occur, the most devastating. He picked up the telephone and asked, for the 4th time, whether there was any intelligence on the status of the aircraft. The answer was, for the 4th time, negative. He thought, this is what not knowing feels like, even when you are in the business of knowing. In Geneva, the wolf was attending a conference. This was not unusual. Grigori attended conferences with some regularity, academic conferences, mostly, where he presented himself as a senior researcher from the Institute for International Studies in Moscow, which was real, and which was one of several academic institutions that served as cover for intelligence activities, which was also real, and which the academics who genuinely worked there accepted with the pragmatic equanimity of people who understand that the state has needs that do not always align with the scholarly temperament. He was, in this persona, a thoughtful and serious researcher interested in European economic integration and its implications for Soviet foreign policy. This was not entirely false. He was genuinely interested in European economic integration. He found it intellectually one of the more interesting problems of the post-war era, the question of whether a collection of sovereign states, each with its own history and economic culture and deep-seated antagonism toward at least one of its neighbors, could genuinely integrate in ways that changed the fundamental calculus of European politics. He had views on this. He had published, under a pseudonym that the Institute maintained, 2 papers on the subject that had been well received in the academic community and that were, he privately considered, better work than most intelligence analysis. But the conference was also a mechanism. It was a mechanism for meeting subject Breyer, who had attended similar conferences over the years in his capacity as a financial consultant with interests in European integration. It was a mechanism for receiving in person information that could not safely be transmitted by cable. It was a mechanism for observing the other attendees, the American analysts, the NATO policy officers who attended in their civilian hats, the German industrialists who were rebuilding their country's strategic position with the relentless efficiency that was the German economic miracle's other face, and taking their measure. Grigori sat through a morning of papers on European monetary policy with the polite attention of a man who is listening to approximately 40% of what is being said and devoting the rest of his considerable mental resources to other problems. The speaker was a Swiss economist, a meticulous and somewhat pedantic Crane, whose analysis of the European Payments Union was technically excellent and personally soporific. Grigori took notes. Some of the notes were about the paper. Others were not. At lunch, he sat next to Heinrich Maus. The Badger was up close, younger seeming than his photographs suggested, early 40s, with the particular look of someone who has spent years in a state of low-grade tension, which gives the face a kind of polished alertness that the unobservant mistake for confidence. He wore a good suit in the Swiss-German mode, conservative quality, designed to communicate that the wearer had money but considered its display vulgar. They ate, they talked about the conference. They talked about the paper on the European Payments Union. Grigori offered a mild criticism of the Crane economist's methodology. Maus responded with an observation about monetary sovereignty that was genuinely astute. Grigori noted this. The man was intelligent. Intelligent assets were complicated assets. They thought about things from more angles than you could anticipate. Gradually, naturally, the conversation moved. There are, Maus said, in the tone of a man making a conversational aside rather than a calculated transmission, some interesting developments in the Italian situation. Italy is always interesting, Grigori agreed. The industrial consortia that work with NATO on logistics, the procurement side, specifically, there have been some restructuring decisions. A pause. The money is moving differently. Grigori absorbed this. The money moving differently, in the specific context that Maus occupied, meant the Gladio network was reorganizing. A reorganization of the Gladio network could mean many things. A response to perceived security breaches, a shift in strategic priorities, preparation for a change in the political situation in Italy, where the Communist Party was, at that moment, achieving results in local elections that were making certain NATO planners distinctly uncomfortable, or simply the routine administrative evolution of a large, distributed network that had been running for 15 years. In which direction? Grigori asked. Maus considered his salad. South, there is a significant increase in the allocation to the southern networks. Specifically, he named an Italian city, then another. Grigori did not write this down. He had not brought a notebook to lunch. He would write it down in his room at the hotel tonight, in the specific notation that his section used for operational intelligence, and it would be transmitted to Moscow the following morning, where it would join the growing file on the Gladio network and the question of what to do with it. The question of what to do with it was not, as Grigori had written in his note on Monday, separate from the U2 situation. The U-2 had given the Soviet Union a demonstration of American aerial espionage. The Gladio intelligence gave them a map of American ground networks. Together, he was thinking this through as he ate his salad and listened to Mouse's carefully measured disclosures. They formed the basis for a bilateral argument. We know what you do from the sky, and we know what you do on the ground. This argument could be made at the summit. It could be made publicly, at the point of maximum humiliation, or it could be made quietly as a private negotiating pressure. Grigory was not yet sure which version he was recommending to the General Secretary. The power of the information was partly in its revelation. You could only reveal it once. In the Kremlin, Khrushchev was meeting with his foreign policy advisors. The Kremlin meetings were, in their structure, entirely unlike their Western counterparts. There was no round table. There was a table at the head of which the General Secretary sat, and around which others sat in order of political proximity to the General Secretary, and the proceedings had the quality of a theatrical performance in which everyone understood their role, except for the moments when the General Secretary improvised, which he was prone to do, and which kept everyone in a state of alert uncertainty that was, Grigory had always thought, probably the point. Khrushchev had the broad, flattened face and small eyes of the badger, but his most characteristic physical quality was his hands. Large, peasant's hands, hands that had worked the Donbass coal mines in his youth and had never quite lost the memory of physical labor. He gesticulated with them constantly, as though the hands were still in the habit of making things, of shaping matter, of insisting through physical force on the world taking the form he intended. "The Americans are lying," he said. This was not an analytical observation, it was a starting position. "They are lying," agreed Andrei Gromyko, the foreign minister, who was a heron, tall, precise, with the heron's gift for standing perfectly still while everything moved around him, which was an excellent quality in a diplomat. "The question is what we say." "We say nothing," said one of the marshals, a bear with the careful conservatism of the military mind. "Let them lie. The surveillance was a violation of Soviet sovereignty. We have the evidence. We use it at the moment of our choosing." "The Paris summit is 16 days away," Gromyko said. "Then we choose our moment before Paris, or at Paris," the marshal shrugged. "Either way, the evidence is the evidence." Khrushchev drummed his hands on the table. "The question," he said, "is what we want from the Americans at Paris. If we expose the lie before the summit, we go to Paris in the position of the wronged party. Eisenhower comes with nothing to offer except apologies." Which, Gromyko noted, may be sufficient. A formal apology, a pledge to cease overflights. These are gestures, Khrushchev said. The word carried everything his contempt could load into it. He stood up, he walked to the window, the Kremlin windows, which looked out over the walls and towers that had been rebuilt and rebuilt and rebuilt through 5 centuries of Russian catastrophe and Russian resilience, and looked at whatever he saw there, which was probably not the view but the problem. "We will say nothing for now," he said eventually. "We will watch what the Americans say, and then we will make our decision." He turned back to the room. "Get me the full intelligence on the Gladio networks," he added, almost as an afterthought. "Everything the wolf has." Chapter 4, Day 4, Thursday, May 5 th, 1960. The Trap Springs. The morning of May 5, 1960, was the morning that Nikita Khrushchev announced to the Supreme Soviet, to Russia, and through the news services to the world, that a U-2 spy aircraft had been shot down over Soviet territory. He did this with the theatrical precision of a man who has been planning a reveal and has been patient about it, which for Khrushchev was an unusual exertion of restraint and therefore all the more satisfying when it was released. He announced that a spy plane had been shot down. He announced its origin. He announced the altitude. He announced, with what observers noted was a particular relish, that the wreckage had been recovered. He did not announce the pilot. Not yet. This was from Grigori's analysis, which he had transmitted to Moscow 2 days ago in a cable-marked operational recommendation, a designation that carried its own kind of authority, the correct strategic move. Announce the aircraft. Let Washington deny. Let Washington commit to the cover story. And then, at the moment of maximum commitment, when the denial had been made publicly and formally and at the highest level, reveal the pilot. Washington denied. The State Department released a statement confirming the NASA cover story. The weather research aircraft, the oxygen failure over Turkey. The denial was firm, official, and public. Secretary of State Herter, a dignified old crane who was, at this moment, in the uncomfortable position of delivering a statement he was 90% certain was false, but which he had been told was the policy, presented the statement with the careful neutrality of a man doing his professional duty in circumstances that were not professionally comfortable. In his office, Bassett read the denial statement and felt, for the first time in his career, a particular species of dread that had nothing to do with personal risk. It was the dread of watching a mechanism you have built perform exactly as designed, in a situation where the mechanism is the wrong tool. The cover story was running. The cover story had committed the United States government publicly. The cover story was about to be destroyed. He did not know this yet with certainty, but he felt it. The intelligence officer's instinct, the wolf's instinct, the eagle's instinct was not about certainty. It was about probability. And the probability that the Soviets had more than the aircraft wreckage was, in his current assessment, rising towards something that it was uncomfortable to look at directly. He picked up the telephone and asked to be connected to the director. "We may have a problem," he said when the director answered. A horse named Alan Dulles, grey, like the president, with the rumpled scholarly quality of the agency's Georgetown origins. The timing of Khrushchev's announcement, the specific information he disclosed. He knows what the aircraft was. He knows the altitude. He knows. He knows what his radar showed him, the director said. The voice was measured. "The specificity is concerning." A silence. "Let's wait," the director said. "See what else they disclose." Bassett waited. On the same morning, in a hotel room in Geneva, Grigory Volkov was writing a letter. Not a cable, not a report. A letter, the old-fashioned kind, in longhand, on hotel stationery, which would not be sent through any intelligence channel, but would be carried by hand to Moscow by a courier who was arriving in Geneva that afternoon ostensibly to attend a conference on agricultural mechanization. The letter was addressed to Deputy Director Serov, and it was, in the 43 years of Grigory's operational life, the most significant document he had ever produced. It was an argument. The argument began with the U-2. The aircraft, the pilot, the film, the equipment, these constituted proof, irrefutable and physical, of American aerial espionage. This proof gave the Soviet Union a position of undeniable moral authority regarding the violation of its sovereign territory. This was, in itself, valuable. But the argument was that the value was greater than its face value. The U-2 could be used to destroy the Paris summit. Khrushchev could arrive at the summit with the aircraft's wreckage, the pilot's testimony, the film, though the film's existence was still being assessed, and demand an apology that the American president, having committed publicly to a lie, could not comfortably give. The summit would collapse. The diplomatic momentum toward a potential arms control agreement would be shattered. The political position of the Western powers would be damaged. This was option A. Option B was different. Option B was to use the U-2 as a negotiating tool rather than a weapon. To approach the summit privately through back channels and offer the Americans a specific arrangement. The incident would be handled discreetly, the pilot returned, the public exposure minimized, in exchange for specific concessions on the question of German reunification, on the question of access to West Berlin, on the question of a test ban treaty. The advantage of option B over option A was, in Grigori's analysis, both strategic and temporal. Option A destroyed the summit and left the underlying tensions unresolved. Option B used the summit's existence as leverage to extract concrete changes. Destroying things was easy. Extracting concessions was harder and more valuable. The complication of option B was that it required Khrushchev to accept a private resolution to a situation that was, emotionally, the kind of situation that Khrushchev did not typically resolve privately. He was a public animal. His politics were performative. The revelation of Americans spying over Soviet territory was exactly the kind of outrage that he experienced with genuine feeling and expressed with theatrical force. Grigori wrote the letter knowing this. He wrote it knowing that he was, in some sense, arguing against the General Secretary's instincts in favor of a sophistication that required those instincts to be overridden. He wrote it because he believed it was correct. He folded it, sealed it, and placed it on the nightstand next to his notebook and his reading glasses. Then he went downstairs to find breakfast, because the argument for civilizational caution did not change the fact that it was 8 o'clock and he had not eaten. In Sverdlovsk, Edgar Vance had a visitor. The visitor was a KGB colonel, a wolf, of a different sort from Grigori, younger and sharper-edged, with the bright-eyed alertness of the interrogator rather than the considered patience of the analyst. His name, as he introduced himself, was Colonel Nikolai Petrov. He sat across the table from Edgar with his hands folded and his expression carefully neutral, and he began the interrogation. What was your mission? What was the route? What photographs were you taking? What is the CIA's program for aerial reconnaissance? Edgar answered none of these questions. He provided his name. He provided the name of his cover organization, the weather agency, the NASA connection, the fiction that he had been coached on and that felt in this room under these circumstances, with this wolf's grey eyes watching him, extraordinarily thin. We know the cover story is false, Petrov said in good English. His English was excellent, which Edgar noted and filed. We have the wreckage of your aircraft, we have your equipment, we have photographs that you were carrying, we know what you were doing. Edgar said, I was conducting a meteorological research flight. We know what you were doing, Petrov repeated, not unkindly. He had the quality, this wolf, of a man who was in no hurry. The question is not what we know. The question is what serves your interests at this point. Edgar thought about this, what served his interests. He was functionally in the position of an animal who has fallen into a trap and is considering whether to gnaw off his leg. The cover story was his leg. The cover story served the program, served the agency, served the government, but those were different interests from his own interests, which were more immediate and more personal, and which included, centrally, the question of what happened to him now. I understand your position, Petrov said. You are trained to resist. That training is appropriate for short-term interrogation, but this is not a short-term situation. He paused. Your government is at this moment making public statements about your mission. They are claiming you were not a spy. They are claiming the aircraft was a weather research plane. He watched Edgar. When this claim is demonstrated to be false, as it will be demonstrated, I can assure you your position becomes interesting. You were a spy who was disavowed by your government. That is a specific legal and diplomatic position. He left the implied conclusion unspoken, which was, Edgar recognized, a sign of professional confidence. I would like to speak with a representative of the American government, Edgar said. Petrov nodded as though this response was entirely expected. That will be arranged in time. He stood. In the meantime, he said, consider what you know about the weather. He left. Edgar sat with the word consideration. He thought about Martha, the owl in Virginia. He thought about the summit. He thought about 63 days of pure oxygen breathing before each flight, about the black sky, about the curve of the earth. He thought, what I know about the weather is that it can change. May 5th, 1960, late afternoon. Khrushchev was back at the podium of the Supreme Soviet. He had timed this beautifully. There is no other word for it, with the theatrical instinct of a man who had grown up in a tradition where the political speech was a performance, where the audience was as important as the content, and where the difference between an effective leader and a merely capable one was the ability to make an audience feel the significance of what they were hearing. He announced that the pilot had survived. He announced that the pilot was in Soviet custody. He announced, and here the International Press Corps, who had filed their stories about weather aircraft and oxygen failures, felt something that was the journalistic equivalent of the floor dropping away, that the pilot had confessed. He had not confessed, not in any complete sense, but he had confirmed his name and his employer and the non-meteorological nature of his mission, which in the grammar of Soviet official announcements was sufficient. Washington went silent. Not the silence of ignorance, that silence had ended. This was the silence of a government that has been caught in a public lie and has not yet decided what to do about it. In his office, Bassett put the telephone down and looked at the wall. He looked at it for a long time. Then he picked up the telephone and said, "Get me the director, and the director needs to get me the president." Chapter 5, Day 5, Friday, May 6 th, 1960. Operation Gladio's long shadow. Rome had a different quality of morning from Moscow or Washington or Vienna or Sverdlovsk. Rome's mornings arrived with a specific combination of pigeon sound, coffee smell, and the ambient argument of a city that was never entirely asleep and never entirely awake. A city that had been doing this for 2,000 years and had developed through practice a relationship to time that was both enormously sophisticated and entirely comfortable with inconsistency. The CIA station in Rome occupied offices that were, in their external appearance, entirely consistent with the other professional offices in their district. Modest, clean, the kind of anonymous respectability that was the architectural equivalent of saying nothing. Internally, they were what they were, a collection of rooms where information came in, was sorted and went out, and where the telephone lines ran to places that would not appear on any public directory. The station chief was an older animal, a hawk named Raymond Clay, who had been in Rome for 6 years and who had in that time developed both an extensive Italian vocabulary and a deep appreciation for the patience that Italian intelligence work required. Italy was complicated. Italy had the largest communist party outside the Iron Curtain. Italy had, partly in response to this, one of the most extensive Gladio networks in Europe. Italy had a government that was pro-NATO and anti-communist, but that was also, in its domestic politics, in a state of continuous creative chaos that required constant monitoring and, on certain specific occasions, intervention. Intervention was a word that Raymond Clay used with the particular care of someone who understood its full range of meanings and preferred not to have to explain all of them to congressional oversight committees. This morning, he was reading the cables from Washington with the expression of someone who was simultaneously unsurprised by their content and alarmed by its implications. The U-2 situation was, in its immediate operational dimension, a crisis. But Rome, specifically, the Gladio networks in Rome, was a different problem, which had its own timeline and its own urgency. The Italian elections were 6 months away. The Italian Communist Party, PCI was polling at approximately 22%. In a parliamentary system with coalition arithmetic, 22% was not a governing majority, but it was close enough to influencing one to constitute a genuine strategic concern. The stay-behind networks of Gladio had been, in their original conception, military, resistance and sabotage in the event of Soviet occupation. But resistance networks, once constructed and maintained and supplied, have a gravitational tendency toward relevance in the present rather than the hypothetical. The training, the funding, the relationships, these did not dissolve just because the Red Army was not currently crossing the Alps. There were elements within the Italian Gladio network. Clay was careful about how he characterized this, even in his private thinking, that had moved beyond their original mandate. Elements that had developed relationships with domestic political movements that were not, strictly speaking, communist, but whose agenda overlapped with certain NATO interests, in ways that the oversight committees in Washington would have found if they had been briefed on them, which they had not been, and which Clay intended to ensure they would not be profoundly uncomfortable. He was not responsible for the history of these elements. He was responsible for the present. The present was an Italian journalist named Marco Colombo in the KGB files, subject Roman. In Clay's files, Asset Monitor 4, which was the station's designation for assets being passively monitored rather than actively run, had recently obtained documents that described the financial architecture of the Gladio network in southern Italy. The documents were partial. They were not by themselves sufficient to expose the network publicly. But they were sufficient to make Colombo a danger, and Colombo was talking to other journalists, and the momentum of that particular conversation had the quality of a ball rolling downhill. There were options for addressing this. Clay did not like most of the options. He had been in this business long enough to know that the options you liked the least were usually the options that the less experienced people around you advocated for most urgently, and that the art of the intelligence professional was partly the art of finding the third option that nobody had mentioned. He was looking for the third option. He wrote a cable to Washington. Gladio Italy situation requires immediate evaluation. Asset Monitor 4 represents potential exposure risk. Recommend consultation before operational decisions. He read this cable back to himself. It was the kind of cable that said a great deal between its lines. It would be read by someone at Langley who would understand what was between the lines and who would respond accordingly. He sent it. Then he made a cup of the excellent Italian espresso that was one of the very few unambiguous consolations of his posting, and he sat with it by the window, looking at Rome. In Moscow, Grigori had received a response to his letter. The response was not what he had hoped for. The response was brief. Serov's responses were always brief, which was a quality that Grigori both admired and found alarming, because brevity in intelligence communication could mean confidence, or it could mean that the decision had already been made before the message arrived. The response said, "The General Secretary has reviewed your analysis. The analytical framework is noted. However, the political calculation has been made. Your continuing contribution to the intelligence preparations for Paris is requested and valued." This was diplomatic language for, "Your recommendation was rejected. Keep working." Grigori read this in his Moscow office on Friday morning and sat for a moment with the feeling that was the intelligence officer's version of grief. The specific sadness of having made the correct analysis and had it set aside in favor of a decision that was being made on grounds other than analysis. He did not argue. One did not argue with Serov's briefing messages. One acknowledged and continued. He acknowledged. He continued. He turned to the Gladio files. The Gladio intelligence that the KGB had accumulated over the previous 18 months was, taken as a whole, a remarkable document. Grigori had been involved in its compilation from the beginning, directing the Vienna and Rome and Bern stations with the systematic attention to detail that distinguished intelligence compilation from mere accumulation. What the files showed was a network, distributed, deniable, interlocked, that existed throughout Western Europe with the specific purpose of ensuring that, in the event of Soviet military advance, there would be organized resistance already in place. This purpose was not secret in its broad strokes. The KGB had long understood the theoretical existence of stay-behind networks. What the files showed in their specific detail was different. The network's actual architecture, its financial flows, its domestic political connections. The domestic political connections were, from Grigori's analytical perspective, the most significant element. In Italy, the Gladio network had connections to a movement called Agenta Press, which was ostensibly a press agency, but was in practice a training center for right-wing paramilitaries with connections to the Portuguese PID intelligence service, to elements within the Spanish government, and to figures within Italian politics whose relationship to democratic norms was, Grigori searched for the precise word, flexible. In Greece, there were connections to military officers whose political sympathies were not socialist. In Germany, there were elements. This was the most delicate part of the files, and Grigori had spent the most time with it, whose operational histories predated their post-war roles and whose previous operational history was, in certain cases, connected to organizations that had been prosecuted at Nuremberg. This was the secret inside the secret, that the network designed to resist Soviet occupation of Western Europe contained within it elements whose resistance was not simply to Soviet occupation, but to the broad democratic consensus that Western Europe's post-war reconstruction had attempted to build. Grigori was not naive about ideology. He had spent his career serving a system that had its own vast catalogue of violences committed in the name of revolutionary necessity. He was not in a position, and he knew this, which was the source of the particular self-awareness that distinguished his thinking from the merely propagandistic variety, to claim moral superiority. But the evidence was what it was. He filed a report, Gladio Italy, connections to extra-parliamentary right documented, financial flows to domestic organizations confirmed, assessment, network represents dual-purpose architecture, military stay-behind in primary mandate, political stabilization, anti-communist in secondary mandate, operational beyond mandate boundaries. He sent this report to Serov. He sent a copy, through a different channel, to the Foreign Intelligence Analysis Division, because it was the kind of report that needed to exist in more than one place. Then he went to the window and looked at Moscow. He thought about the summit. He thought about the two futures, the summit that resulted in an arms control agreement and a reduction in the permanent emergency that had been the post-war world's defining condition, and the summit that collapsed into recrimination and demonstrated, to both sides, that the mechanisms of diplomacy were insufficient to contain the mechanisms of intelligence. He thought about the eagle. He thought the eagle is still in his room. He has now been there 4 days. He knows less about what is happening in the world than the average newspaper reader. He is, in the vocabulary of his profession, completely dark, and in that darkness he is thinking. He is not a foolish animal. He is thinking about what he knows and what he does not know and what the implications of each are. He thought, I would like to talk to the eagle. This was a strange thought for an intelligence officer. One did not, as a rule, wish to talk to one's adversary's agent. One wished to know what the agent knew, which was different from wanting to talk. But the thought persisted. It persisted because Grigori believed, and this was the belief that had survived everything, the purges and the paranoia and the interminable grinding machinery of the intelligence state, that the truth of the Cold War, the thing that both sides almost never allowed themselves to acknowledge, was that the people at the bottom of the mechanism, the pilots, the financial consultants, the field officers, the asset handlers, were not the enemy. They were the instruments. And the question that nobody was asking, because nobody was in a position to ask it, was whether the instruments might have more in common with each other than with the structures that deployed them. He did not act on this thought. It was not actionable. He filed it in the part of his mind where he kept thoughts that were true and not useful, which was a large file, maintained with great care. In Virginia, Martha Vance was in her garden. She was an owl, as has been mentioned, a barn owl, with the heart-shaped face that distinguished her species, the deep, intelligent eyes that could see in darkness, and the particular quality of stillness that owls have when they are observing something, which is not the stillness of inattention, but of extreme attention operating silently. She had received a visit from two men in suits the previous afternoon. They had told her about the weather research aircraft. They had used the words standard procedure and ongoing search efforts, and we're doing everything possible. They had offered to be a point of contact for any questions she might have. She had thanked them, she had provided them with tea, she had asked no questions. She was in her garden now in the early May morning, looking at her bulbs. She grew tulips, the deliberate selection of a woman who appreciates determined, structured beauty and thinking. She was an extraordinarily perceptive animal. She had been, before her marriage and the quiet life in Virginia that the program's operational security required, a lecturer in comparative literature at George Washington University. She had read Chekhov and Tolstoy and Dostoevsky in Russian, which she had learned with the patient thoroughness that characterized her intellectual commitments. She had also read the intelligence behind what the men in suits had told her. The intelligence was in what they did not say. They had not said, "Your husband is dead." This was significant. They had used the language of ongoing search rather than the language of closed cases. They had also not said, "Your husband is safe." This was equally significant. She stood in her garden with her tulips and considered the space between these two absences. And in that space she positioned, with the careful precision of a woman who had spent years accommodating uncertainty, the probability that he was alive and somewhere he should not be, and that the weather research story was what she had always understood it to be. She said nothing to the neighbors. She called no one. She was extraordinarily alone in what she knew. She thought, "Edgar, where are you?" She looked at the Virginia sky, which was blue and enormous and entirely ordinary. Chapter 6, Day 6, Saturday, May 7th, 1960. Confession and collapse. Khrushchev played his final card on the morning of May 7th. He appeared before the Supreme Soviet for the third time in a week, which was itself unusual, a departure from the routine that signaled to observers that whatever was happening with real urgency, and he announced that the pilot had been identified as Francis Gary Powers in our story, Edgar Vance, an employee of the Central Intelligence Agency, and that the pilot had fully confessed to conducting a spy mission over Soviet territory. He then, and this was the move that Grigory, listening to the proceedings on the radio in his office, had identified as the correct one, the move that a strategically sophisticated actor would make, added that he did not believe President Eisenhower himself had authorized the mission. He offered Eisenhower an escape route. He said that perhaps the intelligence agencies had acted without the president's knowledge, that perhaps the president was not responsible. This was an act of calculated generosity designed to make the acceptance of it impossible. Because if Eisenhower accepted the escape route, if he said, "Yes, the CIA acted without my knowledge," he would be admitting that the most powerful intelligence service in the world was operating outside presidential control. This was its own catastrophe. And if he did not accept the escape route, if he stood up and said, "Yes, I authorized the mission," he would be publicly acknowledging that he had authorized espionage against a country with which he was about to attend a peace summit. Either way, the summit was over. This was the trap that Grigori had seen and written about, and that the General Secretary had constructed with the instinct of a man who had spent his career navigating Soviet politics, which was, in terms of its requirements for simultaneous threat assessment and creative response, not entirely unlike chess. In Washington, the response came within hours. The State Department's initial statement was an exercise in institutional agony. It confirmed that intelligence-gathering flights had been conducted, affirmed that they were authorized at the highest level, and did not specify what highest level meant, which everyone understood to mean the Oval Office. Eisenhower, the Grey Horse, sat in the Oval Office and made his decision. He was not, it should be understood, a simple animal. His simplicity was a performance, a cultivated, strategic simplicity, the simplicity of a man who had discovered that appearing simple was one of the most effective ways to manage complex situations. Beneath it was a decades-deep understanding of military strategy, political calculation, and the specific kind of moral accounting that became necessary when you had sent men to die and made the decisions that led to that outcome. He had sent Edgar Vance to fly over the Soviet Union. He had authorized the mission. He had weighed the risk, had been told, by people who had weighed the risk before him, that the aircraft was essentially invulnerable, and had accepted the judgment. The judgment had been wrong. Now he had to decide what to do about it. He decided to tell the truth. Not all of it, not in a way that compromised ongoing intelligence or exposed sources, but the essential truth that he had authorized the flights, that they were reconnaissance missions, that he was not prepared to apologize for protecting American security, and that he was not going to pretend that he was surprised that intelligence agencies gathered intelligence. This decision was, in several respects, extraordinary. It was the first time a sitting American president had publicly acknowledged that the United States conducted espionage against another country. It was the admission of an activity that every government engaged in and every government denied. It was also, from the perspective of the summit, fatal. Bassett, listening to the president's statement, felt something that took him a moment to identify. He had been expecting something, had been braced for it, in the intelligence officer's way of perpetual readiness for the next contingency. But what he felt was not relief or satisfaction, or even the professional acknowledgement of a situation resolved. He felt, with a clarity that was almost physical, the weight of what the photograph in Edgar Vance's personal effects had represented. A specific animal in a specific room in a specific detention facility, who had done exactly what he had been trained and tasked and deployed to do, and who was now, simultaneously, evidence in a diplomatic crisis, a prisoner in a foreign country, and from the perspective of the machinery that had sent him, a problem that had been absorbed into the larger problem and would be dealt with according to the logic of the larger problem. He picked up the telephone. "I need to speak to someone about the pilot," he said. Grigori was, at this moment, on a train. He was traveling from Moscow to Leningrad, which was a journey he had made many times and which he used, when he could, as a thinking time, the particular kind of thinking that horizontal motion through landscape encourages, the thinking that is not directed at a specific problem, but is allowed to move through adjacent territories and return with whatever it has found. He had been recalled from Geneva 2 days ago. The summit preparation was entering its final phase, and his role in that preparation was becoming more specific. He would be part of the Soviet delegation to Paris. He would be responsible for the intelligence assessment of the American negotiating position. He would sit in the rooms where the world's fate was being argued over and listen with the quality of attention he had spent 4 decades refining. But he was thinking about the eagle. He was thinking about what it meant that the United States had chosen honesty, or rather, had been cornered into honesty, which was not quite the same thing but produced some of the same effects. The president had admitted the missions. He had not apologized. He had defended them. This was, from Grigory's perspective, a more interesting response than the alternatives. The cover story would have been easier to handle. A continued lie would have given the Soviet Union the moral high ground without requiring the Soviet Union to engage with the actual question, which was, are aerial reconnaissance overflights a legitimate intelligence activity in a world where mutual distrust is the fundamental condition of great power relations? The admission forced that question. The answer to that question was complicated, and complicated was, in certain respects, more useful than simple. He watched the Russian landscape move past the train window, the birch forests, just coming into their spring green, the flat distances, the particular quality of Russian light in early May, which was not warm but was not cold, which was in transition, and thought about complicated things. He thought, we photograph them from the ground. We have agents in their country, just as they have agents in ours. The difference is altitude and technology and deniability. The underlying activity is identical. He thought if the summit survives, which it will not, because Khrushchev has committed to a performance that requires the summit to collapse, but if it survived, this would need to be said. This would need to be the beginning of a different conversation. He thought the summit will not survive. He watched the birch trees. He thought, and after the summit, what? In Sverdlovsk, Colonel Petrov visited Edgar Vance again. He came in the late afternoon, when the light through the room's single window was the color of old brass, and he sat with the same folded hands posture and the same neutral expression, and he said something that Edgar had not expected. He said, the situation in Washington has developed. He described, in general terms, with the careful selectivity of an interrogator who provides information in order to receive it, the president's statement, the admission of the flights, the defense of the program. Edgar listened. He processed. He thought they didn't disavow me, or rather, they admitted what I was doing, which is not the same as getting me out, but it is something. What does this mean? He asked. Diplomatically, Petrov said, it means the summit is finished. Politically, it means your government has chosen honesty over diplomacy, which is an interesting choice. What does it mean for me? Petrov looked at him, the wolf's grey eyes, steady and assessing. It means, he said, that you are no longer simply evidence in a cover story. You are a participant in a diplomatic incident. This changes your position. A pause. Eventually, it may improve it. Edgar thought about eventually. The pilot who was part of the program before me, he said carefully, came home. There were different circumstances. Different circumstances have a way of becoming similar circumstances. Petrov almost smiled. It was a small movement, quickly contained. You are optimistic. I'm an eagle, Edgar said. Altitude is our default position. Petrov said nothing for a moment. Then, your government's admission changes the nature of the negotiation. This situation will be resolved through that negotiation. The pilot is the asset. Assets are exchanged. He stood. This is not a promise. It is a probability assessment. He left. Edgar sat with the probability assessment. Outside, the Sverdlovsk evening was arriving with the unhurried dignity of high latitudes in spring. The light was lasting longer than it should. The sky, visible through the small window, was the color of something he had not thought about in days, the color of the moment before dark, when the blue deepens and the first stars become possible, and the world is suspended between what it was during the day and what it will be during the night. He thought, I have been in this room for 6 days. In those 6 days, the world has apparently changed substantially. He thought, I would like to know exactly how. He thought, I would like to see the sky properly. He looked at the small square of evening through the window and held onto it with the specific tenacity of someone who understands that the things you can see are sometimes the only things keeping you connected to the things you believe. Chapter 7, Day 7, Sunday, May 8th, 1960. The summit's absence. Sunday in Moscow had a quality that was unlike Sunday anywhere else. The Orthodox bells, which the Soviet state had not entirely managed to silence despite decades of official atheism, partly because certain silences are louder than the thing you're silencing, and the state had enough political instinct to recognize this, rang in the old neighborhoods with the particular tone of metal calling to metal across centuries. The streets, emptied of their weekday purposefulness, had a kind of breathing space. Even the machinery of the state rested, slightly, which was enough of a pause to remind everyone that machinery is not the only thing in the world. Grigory was in his office. He was always in his office on Sundays, or nearly always, which had been the source of one of several conversations with his wife, a small, precise lynx named Vera, who had accepted the realities of his professional life with the specific equanimity of a woman who had chosen her sacrifices consciously and resented them anyway, that had constituted over the years the background music of their marriage. Not an unhappy marriage, a true one which is more complicated than happy. Today he was in his office because the summit was now 14 days away and the situation had crystallized. Khrushchev had decided. The decision had been communicated through channels, Serov to departmental heads to section chiefs, with the characteristic combination of inevitability and urgency that Soviet decisions had when they had already been made at the level where decisions were made, and were now being communicated downward to the level where things were implemented. The decision was, Paris, the summit would proceed, Khrushchev would attend. But he would attend as the wronged party, the sovereign whose territory had been violated, the leader whose goodwill had been exploited by an administration that had authorized espionage while planning a peace conference. He would demand an apology and a guarantee against future overflights. When these were not forthcoming, and they would not be forthcoming because the American president had already publicly declined to apologize, the summit would collapse. This collapse would be public, dramatic, and politically effective. The Soviet Union would emerge from Paris with the moral authority of the nation that had tried, genuinely, to pursue peace, and had been met with the intransigence of a spy power that could not even stop its intelligence agencies for the duration of a diplomatic initiative. This was the calculation. It was not a bad calculation. In the short term, in the month following the summit's collapse, in the newspaper editorials and the United Nations speeches and the diplomatic communiques, it would serve Soviet interests well. Grigory's concern was the medium term. He sat at his desk on Sunday morning and wrote a memo, not the kind that would be sent anywhere, but the kind that intelligence officers sometimes write for themselves, the analytical habit that continues even when there is no audience, about what the medium term looked like. The medium term looked like this. Without the summit, the test ban negotiations stalled. Without the test ban negotiations, both sides continued atmospheric testing, with the radiological consequences that the scientists had been documenting with increasing alarm. Without a reduction in bilateral tension, the arms race continued its specific dynamics. Each advance in delivery system, each new warhead design, each miniaturization of thermonuclear devices, toward a world in which both sides could destroy each other several times over, and were in the process of refining their ability to do so with greater precision and greater speed and greater certainty of mutual elimination. This was not a world that Grigori, who had children and had read philosophy and understood the basic arithmetic of the situation, found acceptable. He wrote in his personal memo, "The failure mode of the current strategic situation is not a single dramatic event. It is the cumulative result of decisions that are each individually rational within their local frame of reference and collectively irrational at the civilizational level. Each side makes decisions that are correct given their assumptions about the other side. The other side's assumptions confirm the original assumptions. The feedback loop closes." He looked at this. He thought, "I have been thinking this for years. I have been writing variations on this memo for years. And the summit is still going to collapse, and the test ban negotiations will still stall, and the feedback loop will continue closing." He put down his pen. He thought about something entirely different, about the U-2, about the eagle in his room, about the fact that this one pilot, this one mission, on this one day, May 1st, Workers' Day, which was at minimum a coincidence with a distinctive sense of irony, had changed the course of the most significant diplomatic initiative of the decade. He thought, this is what power actually looks like, not the armies and the missiles. The photograph of a military installation taken from 70,000 feet, the note from a financial consultant at a conference in Geneva, the decision by one pilot to eject rather than use the mechanism that could not be named. Individual choices made by individual animals in specific moments of specific days, radiating outward into consequences that neither they nor anyone else could entirely control. He thought, and what is the responsibility of the individual animal in this situation? He did not have an answer. He had never had an answer. He had only the question, which he maintained with the diligence of a gardener tending a plant whose fruit he doubted would ripen in his lifetime. In Virginia, Martha Vance had stopped gardening. She was in her living room, watching the television news, not because she expected the news to tell her anything useful about her husband's specific situation, but because the television was the only connection she had to the general situation. And the general situation was what contained her husband's specific situation. And watching the general situation was the closest thing she had to watching out for him. The news was covering Khrushchev's announcements. The coverage had the specific quality of broadcast journalism in the face of something genuinely unprecedented, a slightly elevated formality, as though the gravity of the situation were being communicated partly through the newscaster's posture and tone, rather than through any confidence in the analysis. The American president had confessed to espionage. The Soviet leader had announced a captured pilot. The Paris summit, which had been the great hope of the spring, the summit that was going to begin the long, difficult process of making the world slightly less likely to end, was now in doubt. Martha watched this and understood, with the precision of someone who had more information than the television was providing, what it meant for the probability that her husband would be returned to her. She was not a melodramatic animal. She did not weep. She made herself a cup of tea, which was a habit she had acquired during a graduate year at Oxford, and which she maintained as a practice of domestic continuity in situations that did not offer much else. She sat with her tea and thought about Edgar. She thought about the quality he had had from the very beginning, from the first time she had met him, at a Washington dinner party where he had been sitting in the corner with the concentrated alertness of someone who was watching the room rather than participating in it, and who had looked at her when she approached and said, with complete directness, "I wasn't sure anyone interesting was here tonight, and then you walked in." She had laughed because it was simultaneously the worst pickup line she had ever heard and the most honest thing anyone had said to her in months. The quality was this: he paid attention. He paid the kind of attention that most animals reserved for things they were afraid of, and he paid it to everything, to conversations, to landscapes, to the specific quality of light at different times of day, to the way Martha herself moved through a room. He was, beneath the technical competence and the operational professionalism and all the other armor of his career, a person who found the world genuinely interesting. This quality had seemed, in the years of their marriage, both wonderful and somewhat terrifying. It was the quality that had made him good at what he did, the attention, the precision, the ability to observe without being observed. But it was also the quality that made him available to the program in the way he was. He could not pay attention to things that mattered. And the sky, the view from altitude, the photographs, the sense of being the witness, these were things that mattered to him. She set down her tea. She thought, he is paying attention right now. Wherever he is watching the room. She felt, with the particular confidence of intimate knowledge, that this was true. In Paris, the preparations for the summit were continuing. The city was, in the last days before the arrival of the world's most powerful animals, in a state of anticipatory tension that manifested in the particular way of Paris, through aesthetics rather than politics. The Élysée and the surrounding streets had been made immaculate. The security arrangements were elaborate. The translators and the protocol officers and the logistical specialists had been working for weeks. The hotel suites where the various delegations would stay had been swept for listening devices with a thoroughness that was, in retrospect, somewhat ironic given the nature of the current diplomatic crisis. A French official, a pompous cockerel named Gaston Leclerc, whose enthusiasm for the summit was in direct proportion to his belief that France, under de Gaulle, would be the pivotal mediating presence between the superpowers, was receiving reports from his staff about the preparations with the expression of a man who is managing several simultaneous anxieties while trying to project serenity. The summit was not going to be mediated. The summit was not going to happen in the way it had been planned. Leclerc did not know this yet. He would know it in 9 days, when Khrushchev arrived at the Élysée and began his opening statement with the kind of controlled fury that was the diplomatic equivalent of a very large animal throwing a table. For now, he watched his staff and reviewed his preparations and projected his serenity with the practiced ease of someone who has been doing it for decades. Grigory, on Sunday evening, did something he rarely did. He went home. He went to the apartment in the Arbat district where Vera was preparing dinner. She cooked on Sundays, a ritual she maintained with the same regularity that Grigory maintained his analytical memos, a counter-rhythm to the irregular and demanding tempo of his professional life, and he sat in the kitchen and watched her cook. She was, as has been noted, a lynx, compact, precise, with the tufted ears of her species and the amber eyes that were common among them, and the quality that lynxes have of seeming to know more than they are saying, which in Vera's case was frequently accurate. She had been a mathematician before she had become Grigory's wife, and then his children's mother, and then, as the children grew and left, the mathematician again, teaching at Moscow State University with the kind of patient rigor that her students initially found intimidating and eventually found invaluable. She did not ask him about his work. She had learned, decades ago, that this was a question to which the answers were either lies or classified, and she had decided, with the mathematician's preference for honest information over comfortable fiction, that she preferred silence to lies. She cooked, he sat. The kitchen smelled of onions and bay leaves. "You are thinking about something that troubles you," she said, without looking up from the pot. "I am always thinking about something that troubles me," he said. "This is different." He considered. "There is a situation," he said, "in which the correct decision is obvious, and the decision that will be made is not the correct one, and there is nothing I can do to change it." "Is this unusual?" He laughed. It was a real laugh, which surprised him. "No," he said, "it is the default condition of my profession." "Then why is it bothering you more tonight?" He looked at his hands. They were a wolf's hands, large, capable, with the strong pads and the particular articulation of a species designed for running on difficult terrain. He had sat at desks for most of his adult life. The hands sometimes seemed to him like a promise he had made in youth and never quite kept. "Because this one matters differently," he said. "Most decisions have consequences that are bad for one side and good for another, and the analyst's job is to ensure that the consequences are bad for the other side and good for yours. But occasionally you encounter a decision where the consequences are bad for everyone, regardless of side, and the correct decision, which almost nobody is going to make, is the one that admits this." Vera put a lid on the pot and turned to look at him. "And you cannot make that decision," she said. "I am not in a position to make that decision." "But you have argued for it." "I have argued for it." She nodded with the precise nod of someone who is filing information in the correct category. "Then you have done what you can do," she said. "Eat something." This was not, in any traditional sense, wisdom. It was something more practical than wisdom, the counsel of a person who understood the difference between the problems you can affect and the problems you can only observe, and who had learned to direct energy accordingly. He ate. He thought, "This is what it looks like, the other side of the life I live. The kitchen, the pot on the stove, the person who knows me without needing to know the details. This is what I am protecting when the protection makes sense. And this is what I am risking when the risk is necessary." He thought, and what does the eagle have in his room? He thought a small window, a cup of tea possibly, the memory of the sky. He ate his dinner and said nothing more because there was nothing more to say, and the kitchen was warm, and the onions and bay leaves made the air thick with the specific comfort of the ordinary, which was, on this particular Sunday evening in May 1960, more than he had expected. Epilogue: The Aftermath. What the week left behind. The Paris summit opened on May 16, 1960. Khrushchev arrived with the full weight of his grievance and his theatre, and he delivered in the opening session a speech that was equal parts diplomatic protest and political performance. He demanded an apology, a promise of no further overflights, and the punishment of those responsible. Eisenhower, who had already publicly acknowledged the flights and refused to apologize for protecting American security, offered none of these things. The summit collapsed within the first day. Khrushchev held a press conference that became one of the defining diplomatic spectacles of the Cold War, a badger at full fury, his large hands gesturing with the emphatic conviction of someone who is both genuinely outraged and perfectly aware that his outrage is serving a strategic purpose, which does not make it less genuine. Eisenhower returned to Washington. The summer of 1960 was a summer of nuclear testing, of the arms race accelerating, of the two powers drawing back into their respective defensive positions and regarding each other across the Atlantic with the specific combination of fear and contempt that had characterized their relationship since 1945. Edgar Vance remained in Soviet custody for almost 2 years. His trial, conducted in Moscow in August 1960, in the Hall of Columns, where show trials of a very different kind had been conducted under Stalin, was televised. He was convicted of espionage and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. He conducted himself, throughout the trial, with the quiet dignity of someone who has had considerable time in a small room to determine what his values actually are. In February 1962, at the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin, the bridge that would become the specific geography of Cold War exchanges, a border crossing between the worlds, he was exchanged for a KGB agent who had been convicted and imprisoned in the United States. The exchange was conducted in the early morning, in the grey February light, with the professional discretion of both sides. He walked across the bridge from east to west. Martha was waiting. She had not seen him for 21 months. He was thinner, and the fur of his wings was slightly different, flatter, more subdued, as though the altitude had left his plumage and had not yet quite returned. But his eyes were the same. The attention, the quality of seeing that had always been his defining characteristic, was present and intact. She said nothing for a moment, neither did he. Then she said, "I kept the tulips going." He said, "Tell me everything that happened." And she did. She stood with him in the February grey at the edge of the bridge and told him everything that had happened in 21 months of the world continuing without him. And he listened with the quality of attention that had always been his gift, and gradually, as she spoke, his wings extended slightly, not flight, not yet, but the instinctive movement of a creature remembering what its body is for. Operation Gladio was not publicly acknowledged until 1990. Giulio Andreotti, the Italian Prime Minister, confirmed its existence in October of that year to the Italian Parliament. The confirmation produced a political earthquake in Italy and considerable discomfort in Belgium, Germany, Greece, Turkey, Switzerland, and several other nations whose similar networks were suddenly, in the light of the Italian disclosure, considerably more visible. The investigations that followed revealed what the files had long contained, that the network, designed for resistance in the event of Soviet occupation, had, in various national implementations, been used for purposes that were not limited to that mandate. In Italy, the connections to domestic political violence were investigated. In Belgium, the network's role in the so-called Gang of Naval Crimes was examined. In Greece, the network's relationship to the colonel's coup of 1967 was considered. None of the investigations were complete. Most concluded that the full picture of Gladio's activities would never be established with certainty, partly because the network had been designed for deniability and had succeeded in that design. Heinrich Mauss' subject Breyer, Contact 7, was never publicly identified. He continued his financial consulting in Vienna until his retirement in the late 1970s. He died in 1993, leaving behind, in addition to a comfortable estate, a collection of letters that his family chose not to make public. Grigory Volkov served in the KGB until 1971, when he retired at the rank of general. He published, in the late 1970s, under his own name, a series of academic papers on Soviet-Western relations that were notable for their analytical precision and their willingness to acknowledge, in carefully measured academic language, the degree to which both sides of the Cold War had consistently misread the other's intentions. The papers were read carefully in Western intelligence circles and received without comment. He died in 1987, 3 years before the Soviet Union began its own collapse, a collapse that he had, in his final years, assessed as probable without quite believing, because certain things are too large to believe until they happen. His desk, when his colleagues cleaned it out, was clean. What does a week mean? 7 days, 168 hours. The specific, contingent, irreversible passage of time between one Sunday and the next. In the week that this story has tried to inhabit, the first week of May 1960, the week that began with an eagle at 70,000 feet and a wolf in a radar room, and ended with a summit in preparation and a world that was about to learn something about itself, nothing was decided that was not already in the process of being decided. The forces were already in motion. The aircraft was already in the air. The cover story was already in its file folder. The network was already spread across Europe like a root system, beneath a garden that looked peaceful from the surface. What the week did was make it visible. The eagle's fall made visible the fact of overflights. The overflight's visibility made visible the nature of the surveillance state. The surveillance state's nature made visible the specific contradiction at the heart of the Cold War, that two systems which declared themselves opposites had, in the practice of their mutual watchfulness, become mirrors. Each had networks of agents in the other's territory. Each photographed the other from distance and altitude, and through technical means that the other could not see. Each maintained, at enormous cost, the infrastructure of distrust. The mirror image was not comfortable. The eagle saw it from his window in Sverdlovsk, when he understood that his interrogators were not monsters but professionals, different professionals in a different uniform serving different ends, but recognizable in their professionalism. The wolf saw it from his kitchen in Moscow on a Sunday evening, when he thought about what the eagle had in his room and compared it to what he himself had in his kitchen. Neither of them could do anything with the recognition. The recognition was true and not useful, which is the category that contains most of the important things. The U-2 incident contributed directly to the collapse of the 1960 Paris summit, delaying substantive arms control negotiations until the limited test ban treaty of 1963, signed in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was itself, in significant part, a consequence of the strategic conditions that the summit's failure had left in place. Operation Gladio's existence was officially acknowledged by the Italian government in 1990. Ongoing investigations across Europe have not fully established the extent of the network's activities beyond its original defensive mandate. Francis Gary Powers was exchanged at the Glienicke Bridge on February 10, 1962, for KGB spy Rudolf Abel. He returned to the United States, published a memoir, and worked as a helicopter traffic reporter in Los Angeles. He died in a helicopter crash in 1977 at the age of 47. The sky above Sverdlovsk, now Yekaterinburg, is the same sky it has always been. It does not remember what passed through it. The earth below remembers everything. A final note on the animals. The eagle is chosen for America not merely for its official symbolism, the bald eagle, the seal, the currency, but for what eagles are, creatures of altitude, of long vision, of the overview. They see further than other animals. They also necessarily see from a distance. The danger of altitude is that it produces a specific kind of clarity, detailed, analytical, accurate at the level of the individual object, that is simultaneously a kind of distance from the life that the object is embedded in. You can see the road, but not the animal on the road. You can see the installation, but not the animals who maintain it. Altitude is a form of intelligence and a form of blindness simultaneously. The wolf is chosen for Russia not merely for its Slavic resonance, the wolf of the steppes, the old forest predator, the creature that the Russian folk imagination has always maintained a complicated relationship with, but for what wolves are, creatures of the pack, of territory, of the long watch. Wolves are patient in a way that most predators are not. They hunt by following, by narrowing, by the patient elimination of the prey's options over distance and time. They are also, and this is the thing the folk imagination sometimes forgets, highly social animals, with complex hierarchies and genuine affective bonds. The lone wolf is a dramatic image and a poor description. The Cold War in this reading was partly a conflict between different relationships to knowledge, the eagle's aerial overview versus the wolf's ground-level territory. Both were effective, both were limited. The tragedy was not that one was right and the other was wrong, but that neither could quite see what the other saw. What they shared, what the eagle and the wolf both possessed, and both occasionally recognized, and could never quite act upon, was the knowledge that the earth is finite, and that the things done to it and in it accumulate, and that there is a cost to the calculation of deterrence that the calculation itself cannot compute. They were, in the end, different animals living in the same world. This is, perhaps, the oldest story there is. Wings and teeth, end. Appendix Historical Note. The U-2 incident, May 1, 1960. Pilot Francis Gary Powers was shot down over Sverdlovsk, now Yekaterinburg, while flying a CIA reconnaissance mission over Soviet territory. The incident led to the collapse of the 1960 Paris summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev. Powers survived, was captured, tried for espionage, and sentenced to 10 years. He was exchanged at the Glienicke Bridge on February 10, 1962, for Soviet spy Rudolf Abel. Operation Gladio, the code name for a series of NATO-coordinated, stay-behind networks established throughout Western Europe after World War II. Designed to provide organized resistance in the event of Soviet military occupation, the networks were maintained in secret for decades. Italy's Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti publicly acknowledged the Italian network's existence in October 1990. Subsequent investigations in multiple countries revealed that the network's activities had, in various instances, extended beyond their original defensive mandate. The Paris Summit, May 16–17, 1960. The planned four-power summit between the leaders of the United States, Soviet Union, United Kingdom, and France collapsed on its first day when Khrushchev demanded an apology for the U-2 overflights that Eisenhower declined to provide. The Glienicke Bridge, Berlin, the bridge spanning the Havel River between West Berlin and Potsdam, became the site of several notable Cold War prisoner exchanges. Its use as an exchange point, its literal position between East and West, made it one of the Cold War's defining physical symbols.